Yes. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Government Operations Committee meeting of Wednesday, February 18th. Up for consideration first is the charter of the city of Burlington, which passed the House earlier. This is H508. And we're going to be joined today by folks from the city. We have our legislative council in as well. I don't know if anybody on the screen has time constraints. We'll take you first if you do. If not, we'll and I'll let Attorney Anderson not walk us through the whole bill again, but maybe I'll outline what our concerns are, and then you folks can weigh in. So the meat and potatoes, Tucker, you can grab a seat. The meat and potatoes of this was on the first 13 pages of the bill, which had been deleted in essence. And so on page 13, it starts again with an approval of the city of Burlington's charter. And then we have the rest of the bill. So the question that came up in committee, and I was hoping Representative Cooper would be here, but he isn't. The last section of the bill allows the city to every 5 years redesign the wards in the city to some degree. And our question, I guess, was, and it says election area changes should not be made more frequently than once in 5 years. So every other 5-year period, there would be a census anyway. And I think that that would normally be the time at which most municipalities would take census figures and figure out, especially in cities where you have wards. It isn't maybe as necessary in Eden, Vermont, for instance, but in Burlington, it certainly is. But there was no specific method for determining where those patterns of population might have changed or moved. So it seemed to us that that was something that either we should get involved with or we should not necessarily allow it every 5 years. I'm not probably setting it up very well, but in other words, every 10 years you got a census, and we can understand, you could take a look at the population of each ward. I'm trying to remember how many wards in Burlington, 7 or 8. You know,
there's 8 wards and then 4 overlapping districts.
Okay. But in the interim, in the intervening years between the censuses, censi, whatever the plural of census is, come to that decision.
I would be happy to start, and I'll introduce myself too, just for the record. I'm Jessica Brown. I'm the Burlington City Attorney, and I'm joined by my colleague, Assistant City Attorney Eric Ramakrishnan. And so for me, it's kind of easiest to think about this using an example. Housing is a big issue in Burlington right now and around the state really, but certainly in Burlington. And so if we think about building new housing, let's say an apartment complex in one of our wards, we could use census data because it is provided in between census years, right? It's ongoing data and information that we can obtain. Using census data, if we determine that a new housing development in a particular ward is going to cause a gap in that of more than 10%. So if Ward 8 gets a new housing development and suddenly its population the population of Ward 8 is going to be more than 10% greater than another ward or other wards, the proposed charter language here would allow us, without having to go through the charter change process, but with the approval of voters, to adjust the boundaries between Ward 8 and other wards, or the neighboring wards, to rebalance the population, right? So, Eric, do you want to? attempt
Yeah,
to
no,
answer that as well if I'm not doing the best job.
I think Jessica's answer is correct. The intent behind the from time to time, but not more often than 5 years, was that we do have a number of housing developments coming online, and that could create inequities between wards, as Jessica indicated. We wanted to make it not more than more often than once every 5 years, so that it couldn't be abused in any way. But we wanted to give the city council some discretion to reset boundaries more often, because we do expect to have housing come online, and we do expect that to generate inequities if we don't address them right away. And generally, courts have said that, you can have up to a 10% imbalance and we'll call that good. But if you get over 10%, we have concerns. We could end up with a more than 10% imbalance, in between decennial censuses. And the census keeps data all the time about population. They use the American Community Survey. They use projections based on past population trends. And it's generally considered to be good data. So there is census data more often than, once every 10 years when the Census Bureau does the hard count. So that was the logic behind those provisions.
So, Steve.
Can I just clarify, and maybe someone from the city council or someone else would be the person to answer that, but they're not here. So is the intent that the voters would have to approve that redistricting happens, or that the voters would have to approve whatever redistricting is proposed?
It's the latter, because right now, because under current law, every time we redistrict, it requires a charter change. And I would like to speak to the fact that was, just sort of an anomaly of history. It was never planned that way. But under current law, we have to take redistricting first to the voters and then to the legislature. We're still proposing to take things to the voters just because they've become accustomed to that and they want to be part of the process. But we wouldn't have to go to the legislature, which can become an impediment to redistricting when we need to achieve that balancing that Jessica and I talked about.
That makes perfect sense. What I was just trying to clarify, because the way I heard you propose the voters is that the voters would have to, what the voters' involvement is that they would have to approve that you get to do redistricting. But what is in the bill is that they approve the districts that are proposed. And so
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. And I apologize. Yeah, I apologize for the confusion.
No worries. I'm just looking to see if I had any other questions. I don't think I do for the city of Burlington. I think I'm my privileged for the council.
So, Senator Morley.
I'm still a little confused on how they're going to track and monitor population movement. I kind of heard two things. One was the housing, potentially some housing going in, and you kind of monitor that. And then the other was you have access to Census Bureau information. I don't know if it's annually. I thought it was every 10 years. I didn't know you could go get Census Bureau data like 3 years after the last census. And then my other question is, so you did have housing development, say it was a large one in one ward. You don't know if I'm not sure you would know if the people that went to that development was from outside of Burlington or moving from one ward to another ward. So I'm a little confused on that.
That's a legitimate question.
So if I may, first of all, I'm not a demographer, so I may not be able to provide the best explanation, but to the limited extent of my knowledge of how these things work, the American Community Survey is an ongoing survey that the census does every year. Some of you, I've received the survey in the mail a few times in my life. Some of you may have as well. So the every 10 years, because it's constitutionally required, because back in 1790, I forget what year, I apologize. We didn't have highly developed statistical sampling models. And so it was assumed that every 10 years we would do a hard count of every head in the country. But since then, demographers have developed really sophisticated statistical modeling tools. And so the census is actually keeping ongoing population data by census area. in between that 10 years. And they do that through the American Community Survey and other methods that are, as I said before, are generally considered accurate. So we have ongoing census data. The measure would require the city to use census data that's built into the language. And census data, again, it's constantly being updated. It's ongoing. It doesn't just come out every 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
So my question is, go ahead, Jessica.
Well, I was just going to respond to your specific question about, I guess I don't, whether folks moved into a ward from outside of Burlington or moved from one ward to another, if it created this gap of more than 10%, like an imbalance of more than 10% between wards, that would be the issue that would trigger the redistricting.
Yep, okay.
Okay.
Senator Nielsen?
This is a question for legislative council, but is what I understand the trigger that you're naming as the trigger for doing this. Does the language as it is in this bill represent that trigger?
Good afternoon, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Council. There is no articulated trigger in the language. And to recap the discussion from last time and just to understand my charge here today and some of the questions that came up. You had asked me whether this sort of authority is available to other municipalities, charter municipalities in the state, what the triggers are for reapportionment broadly, right, and the sort of data that might be used. And we covered some of the chartered municipalities the last time that I was in here. I would note that the language that's in front of you falls out of line with those municipalities because it is more restrictive than the authority that is granted to every other city in the state in their charter. As I recounted last time, the authority that's delegated to the city of Barrie, the city of St. Albans, Vergennes, we can go through an entire list of the municipalities that you use ward-based voting, is a general authority to redistrict wards within the municipality as an ongoing process in response to population shifts. So the restriction, the 5-year restriction, is nuanced here. And I would note that in all those other charters, there's no specific trigger for what would come up.
They could do it.
It's similar, not the same, but similar to the triggers for periodic reapportionment at the state level. The Constitution simply calls for periodic reapportionment. It requires it in the biennial session following the taking of the decennial census. But otherwise, the General Assembly has the ability to respond to dramatic population shifts if they happen in between the decennial census. So what you had asked me to be prepared to discuss today is whether the city is restricting itself in a way that could actually hamper a response to necessary periodic reapportionment of the wards due to a dramatic population shift. So for example, if after the taking of the decennial census, the city reapportions the wards, there is a 5-year period where the city council does not have the ability, according to the express terms in the charter, to reapportion, which would require the voters, if they didn't, for example, that there was more than a 10% deviation, or that suddenly there's 5 new developments in a ward in a completely hypothetical situation, that they would have to go through a judicial process to compel reapportionment, right? They would make a constitutional claim that there is voter dilution because of the scheme that was adopted after the decennial census.
And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the problem the city is trying to solve. And I guess I am just, I think we had spoke as a committee the first time we discussed this charter about maybe not doing the limit to 5 years, but instead putting a trigger in that gets to what they're saying, like if X, then Y, right? Like if the wards are out of balance by more than 10%, then you may redistrict. And I wonder with the city here, if that better gets at the concern we have and solving the problem you are trying to solve.
I mean, the overarching problem that we're trying to solve is that if we do think that we are unconstitutionally imbalanced, right? Our wards, right? And I should have said that, I'm using 10% as a touchstone because that's what the courts have sort of identified. Like if there's this 10% imbalance, that's considered minimal. But kind of beyond that, they want to see reapportionment, right? So we want to be able to do that without it requiring a charter change that requires going to the voters and then to the General Assembly, right? So that's our overarching goal. And if having specific language that triggers when we can redistrict or, adjust our wards versus kind of limiting ourselves. I mean, I think we were trying to address potential concern that, without some sort of limitations, that the power could be used, not necessarily just to actually address population imbalance in wards, but to try to gain, political advantage, that sort of thing, right? But if it makes more sense to the committee that we have specific language identifying sort of what triggers when the city can redistrict versus, limiting ourselves to a certain time period, then I don't think that negatively impacts what we are trying to do ultimately.
Yeah, that's really helpful for me to know. And I appreciate, I just want to say thank you to everyone who worked on it in the city and sort of acknowledging the point in time we're at, where we really need to proactively say, like, we don't want this abuse. So that makes sense to me. And I wonder if language that sort of, now that you've heard the sort of intent, if language that get that, like if the population shifts to a point, then the city may redistrict and eliminating the 5-year mark so that the limit and the protection is what is the trigger rather than a time frame. Is that language based on the intent you've heard that is craftable?
I can certainly do that. And I would note that if you eliminate some of the limitations that Burlington has put in there and grant the general discretion to reapportion, that the discretion to reapportion based on population shift is part and parcel of that. So there is language that I can show you from the other charters that has a clause stating, as necessary to ensure equal distribution of population on the boards.
If I could add a point.
Sure.
I think this is all excellent. And I think, the primary challenge for Burlington is just we want to be able to reapportion and we want to be able to be responsive to population shifts without having to seek special legislation every time, which nobody else in Vermont has to do. And so however we get there, I think is what the city was trying to achieve. But I do just want to comment that some of these issues I feel like are more statewide issues than Burlington specific issues. And so I do want to suggest that to the extent we're trying to sort of solve for a larger problem, maybe that should be done through the general laws rather than necessarily working with the language the voters approved. That said, again, I think the bottom line is the city just needs the discretion to respond to population shifts, period.
I think the concern with the language that was approved by the voters is it actually limits your ability, like if next year, so I mean, okay, if in 2031 you've done your reapportionment and in 2033 a huge housing development goes and you can't fix it with the language that you sent us, you have to wait an additional 2 years because it's within the 5-year window. So I think that the problem we're trying to solve in the language is giving you the authority to actually respond without hampering on a time frame. But yeah.
So can I ask, what's the average size of a ward in Burlington, the 8 wards? How many people?
We could figure that out quickly. So we've got 43,000.
It's 5,000 approximately.
Can you identify yourself, sir?
Yeah. Gene Bergman, I'm Ward 2 City Councilor. I was the chair of the Charter Change Committee when this item was put forward to the voters. I was a 20-year city attorney for the city of Burlington as well, and also then served as a city councilor in the 1980s.
So the language that we have before us would allow the city council to, in essence, redraw lines on a map to make all those 8 wards as representative as possible.
I mean, I think I need to clarify that right now you have a process which has the city council drawing lines and then putting it for before the voters for a charter change. And this is really no different in that regard. And it is a hard process in and of itself. Anybody who has gone through that, who's been on a committee to reapportion districts, knows that. And it often requires there to be certain adjustments. We did that with a university ward, our Ward 8, when then the populations came up. So this is, I think, the necessary in the overarching point of view, a necessary change that we need to have to be able to facilitate our ability to best draw the lines here.
Yeah, there's 2 members of this committee that were on the reapportionment board when both the House and Senate drew new lines.
So you know.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think.
In 22, it was terrible.
22. Oh, sorry. Yeah, obviously, if you get 5 people in a room, you're not going to have 100% agreement about where those lines should be, and that was true. They would, in my way of thinking, there would have to be a very large housing development, which could impact to the degree that I'm thinking about, maybe even more than 1 or 2 developments, in order for it to really get out of whack. I don't know.
Well, Cambrian Rise could do that tomorrow.
Yes. Yes, so you have Cambrian Rise, and that was a major thing. You had university developments that really caused us to have to figure out a way to create a ward in the center part. And our first attempt at that created a salamander effect. You know, because you've gone through it, all of the political machinations that go, and people are very particular in the city to their geographic locations. We have a new North End. You know, those of you who know Burlington, you have an old North End. You've got a downtown. You've got a South End. But you start to get areas of the city where large development is only possible, and it really does create that dynamic tension. So not only is Cambrian Rise one of those places, and the university was one, but we're going to have, if we are lucky, a very large housing development in the South End, around what was across from the old General Electric plant, now the Hula building, and where the Social Security office is. And so we're looking at, Eric or Jessica, correct me, 1,100 units there. I mean, it will be wonderful for the state of Vermont. Really wonderful for our housing issue, really dealing with the request that we build housing for, particularly for workforce development housing. But that is going to create some major redistricting issues here because of just the size and the scope of it. So I personally, as somebody who shepherded that, who went through both as a staff person, as an attorney for the earlier redistricting, and then as a city councilor, I really do appreciate that flexibility that you're talking about. And I think it is very consistent with what we put forward to the voters and what people are looking for, which is that at the end of the day, voters get a chance to say, this is where we want to divide Ward 2 and 3. Do we want to divide the line on Elmwood Avenue from the post office to what used to be called H.O. Wheeler School, now it's the Arts Academy, or do we want to put it up and down North Street so that it goes from the lake, to the to like Willard Street, to Route 7? And you know, it actually makes a big difference for people, but that's, you know, that's what we do with the votes and have you, and that is the most fundamental question that we have, so that then we can just, once the voters say, yeah, these lines make sense, then we can implement it instead of this important but hard process that we have here today and what you've had elsewhere at other time.
So if I'm hearing Senator Bielanski's suggestion, it would appear that if we just left the 5-year reference point out
Yes.
and allowed the city council, I'll get to my question here in a minute, to, when they felt it necessary, based on some data, to redraw lines, that they could do that. I understand why you hesitated to allow that to happen on an annual basis. I really do. But here's my question. Does it make sense for us to reference census data in order for this to take place? In other words, I don't know how else you would do it. So maybe you would do it by default anyway, but I don't know how you would feel if we said that you had to use the intervening census data that you get on an annual basis in order to say, hey, wow, look at what happened in the last 12 months. Ward 4 is way out of whack with the rest of them. We need to redraw the lines. So how do you feel about taking the 5-year period out, but then making sure that there's some reference about how you are going to determine the population shifts?
I was just trying to look for the statute that I had up, and then it disappeared on me on my computer. I mean, I think that we do reference in the charter change the census data, and I think that the removal of the 5-year is sort of consistent with what the overarching thing that we were trying to do. And just trying, I don't think it will be very practical to be changing districts every 2 years, every 3 years, right? I mean, it's just a hard process any way you look at it. So the removal of the 5 years, I think, is consistent with the voters' intent, and it having a reference to census data, because at the end of the day, that's, you know, the foundation on which we've got to figure out what parcels go where.
Yeah, you're right. It does say in accordance with data produced by the U.S. Census Bureau. Could it mean at some point that a polling location, which existed before in Ward 5, but based on new lines, is no longer where those people will go to vote?
Yes, which is why I think you allowed us to change that restriction last charter change, so that we could put it in a place that was proximate, if it made sense. And in fact, we had to do that for one of our wards, because we've traditionally put them in the Edmonds Middle School gym, and then it actually moved out of the ward, and there was nowhere else that it could be done. And we have done that now under the previously amended charter for Ward 6, maybe even Ward 8 and Ward 2, because my ward, the voting was at the H.O. Wheeler School, the Arts Academy, and we had to move it to the one center on North Street, because that was under renovation. We needed to totally redo the school, and it was closed for several years. Now we're going to go back to our historic place. So yes, I think we have taken care of that. Sorry for all the detail.
No, it's fine.
I appreciate the sort of concern and what we don't want to see happen, right? Where someone says, oh, I don't like the results of those elections, let's redistrict. Do you feel that doing what Chair Collmore and I have suggested protects against that adequately if we remove that 5-year piece? Or I want to really give you the flexibility and the protection that I hear is the intent of this charter change. So
I mean, yes, I do. I think that there are institutional and cultural reasons that don't, you know, move us to be doing redistricting easily. And at the end of the day, in order to figure out what the you know, whether you need to or not, because it's not a pleasant, you guys have to do it like we were just talking. It's not a pleasant process to go through. The census becomes the, you know, the driving force for understanding if there are imbalances or not. And there will be imbalances as time goes on, just because of the opportunities for housing development that exist in a variety of different places in the city. There are just not that many places where you can get the type of infill development that you know, that we're looking for, and so that will then create those changes. But people are also, like I said, pretty set in understanding their neighborhoods and their communities, and you undermine that at your political risk.
Yeah, I know you still, there are people in Rutland, we did it every 10 years. They still go to the old place 9 years later. They still don't have the old place. Why can't I
Yeah.
vote here?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Seen it all the time.
Yeah. So this is a question for council that may lead to a question for you, and that is if you have had time to look and see what general law provisions there are about the requirement that this be done at least every 10 years.
So I am not aware of a general law requirement for reapportionment, specifically because these are systems that are set up by charter.
Okay, so then that does pivot me to a question for the city of Burlington. I can't imagine, given the dynamic nature of the city of Burlington, that you could imagine this happening. But I wonder if there is, what the thoughts would be on sort of curtailing on that end too, saying you may do this if you need to, but you must do this at least every 10 years.
I mean, we've talked about this because it was brought to our attention that it might be a concern. And it's hard to imagine, to your point, it's hard to imagine like that. We have the opposite problem, right? That we most likely will, you know, that I think you've identified, like, why would we limit ourselves to every 5 years and potentially risk that, you know, 2 years passes and we actually need to redistrict. So that I think is more likely than that 10 years would go by and we wouldn't want to redistrict, or but I think that your proposal, rather than limiting ourselves by a number of years, you know, once every 5 years, limiting is not exactly the right word, but like perhaps including language that we may do this if, based on Census Bureau data, we see that the population of one ward has now, you know, that there is this more than 10% imbalance, provides the limitation so that so that the power is not abused, right? But also says when this happens, basically you need to do it. And if that's less than 5 years from the last time you did it, that, you know, that's okay. But it would mean that 10 years couldn't go by. And if there's a 10% or more imbalance between wards, the city wouldn't be allowed to let 10 years go by and not do anything. But I also just want to sort of reference a point that Eric made earlier. Because I don't think there's any language with, you know, in the charters of any of the other municipalities around redistricting wards or reapportioning wards or districts that says they have to do it, you know, every 10 years. And so that maybe is sort of a state legislation consideration as opposed to specifically putting that language in Burlington's charter or any other municipality's charter.
That makes a lot of sense. And I really like the proposal and the sort of way you framed that of sort of if one ward is out of balance in such a way, then you will read it. Like it's less of a you may redistrict and more of a you shall redistrict.
Right.
I think that seems like the solution to get the city of Burlington, the protection of this being abused and the flexibility to do this that they're looking for. And I'm happy to work with Tucker to figure that language out.
Senator Clarkson.
I can't even imagine this being abused given how torturous the process is.
That's right.
I mean, I would not use the word abused in this context.
What I heard from the intent of the folks here, though, is they wanted to put some protection on that. So my goal is to deliver to my constituents in Burlington what they're asking for.
So we've been joined by Representative Bob Hooper. I'm just kind of curious. I'm not, trust me, pointing fingers or anything. Did this come up at all in the House when the charter was talked about, or are we chasing something that doesn't really need to be chased?
Or, yeah.
The 5-year item. Yeah, apologize for being late.
That's okay. You can take the chair, Bob.
We had a conversation about it and, oh, sorry. Bob Hooper, House Bill Bob. We had a late conversation about it and, recognized that information on being able to actually draw the lines was probably pretty much consistent and contingent upon what the Census Bureau would put forward. There are a couple of areas in Burlington, particularly where Farrow is building out in the new North End or on the dividing line, where the population probably shift pretty quickly.
We talked, before you got here, we talked about Danbury, Rise and Hula.
So again,
Before you got here, we did discuss the population impact of Cambria and Rise and
Yes.
Hula.
that's what I'm talking
And
about.
Hula.
But I mean, that's going to have an impact on 3 or 4 wards, possibly like balloon everybody. So waiting for a census that takes in most of the city would probably be advisable for that also.
Senator Yost.
So what we also heard before you got here is that there is yearly census data available. And
So it's every year.
right, and that the language as is being proposed is that they shall do this if that data indicates
Yes.
basically unconstitutional, regardless of the time frame.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering that
Can you give me, or maybe the whole committee, a sense of how long has Burlington had 8 wards? Did it start with just 4, and as the city continued to grow, it created new wards, or do you have any knowledge of that, or anybody else?
2012 or 13 is when we went from 7 to 8 wards. And then in the last go round, which I think was in 22, maybe we created the districts, and part of that just relates to the number of city councilors and the debate as to how many city councilors to have. Is 12 enough? Is 16 too much? Is 8 the right amount? It's
Well, on our level, there was consternation in some areas about what we used to call the 6-pack from Burlington or from Chittenden County. And in the end, Chittenden County wound up getting an additional senator, Chittenden North, that didn't exist before the reapportionment. So it's obvious that Burlington is continuing to grow. I'm from an area that unfortunately is seeing the opposite happen. So I mean, that's the way things go. People move for different reasons, and good for them. Yes.
Can I ask just a logistical question?
Sure.
If I craft language with our legislative council to do what we all talked about, who would be the best person to send it to take a look at? I don't want to do something that you all haven't gotten to see and look at and be like, yep, that does what we want it to.
Please send it to me and I'll share it with my colleagues in the city attorney's office. We'll review it. And certainly can share it also with with the council president and maybe the caucus chairs for the council.
Perfect, thanks. Logistically want to know who's the right person to do the work with.
If we amend it, or go back to Bob's committee.
Ask a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Given the number of counselors was going to refer to, how many city councilors are there?
Well,
There are 12.
So
So
current-
each ward has one, and then also, and then 2 wards combined to make a district, and so there are district councilors as well. So 8 ward councilors and 4 district councilors.
How often do you have split votes? That are exactly split. I mean, that's awkward to have an even number.
It's, well, there's 7 Dems and
Sometimes.
5 progressives right now, so we hardly ever have split votes.
Thanks.
any other questions from the committee? Okay,
Well, this is.
anything else you'd like us to know on the screen?
There is one point I almost feel like I don't need to make it because I think you grasp what we're trying to do. But one that I did get into the record in the House and just want to explain here. The whole reason why a question that came up before the House committee was, well, what was the intent behind requiring a charter change and going to the legislature in the first place, and what brought that about? And just to clarify that, in case that's a question in anyone's mind, it's in 1949 we didn't have one person, one vote. That was the constitutional principle that was announced in 1964, and so it was sort of now we take it for granted, but at once upon a time it wasn't really heard of, and so the idea of having population imbalance between constituencies was an accepted part of life. So when the original ward boundaries and the locations of polling places and things like that were written into the charter, it was expected to be like that for all time, and so it wasn't an intentional thing that we would have to go to the legislature when we wanted to change boundaries. We just didn't think we were ever going to change them. So anyway, thank you for letting me point that out.
I really appreciate that historical knowledge. Thank you. And I think it sort of speaks to why it's important to get the language right, because where we're sitting at this point in time may not be where we're sitting 70 years from now. And we're talking about a Burlington that never thought they'd have to change the district lines. And now we're like, oh, you might have to change them every 2 years. We don't know. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having us back.
Okay, we'll send something along, I'm sure.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
So committee, we also have the Essex Charter to consider. But why don't we